All right, so let's see exactly how this is going to work. Trying a little bit of a different configuration to be able to do my live stream. And I don't know if this is going to end up being the best. I see it's going to show up on my channel as default stream created by ManyCam, um, which is interesting, but it's not giving me chat functionality. So I don't know that I'm going to stick with this. But just for now, let me just work through this right here because I'm going to want to look back at this recording and see if this is at all useful. Of course, the goal in the long term is to be able to run my principles and my intermediate micro lectures, actually hopefully starting next week in the evenings, since I won't be doing recordings during regular lectures. Anyway, so this is just a file that I created real quick just so I'd have an ability to be able to create a live stream, then look back at it and have something, some type of value created here. Unfortunately, it's not setting up the chat. I can't see if people are joining, so I'm gonna have to look back at this later, and maybe it'll end up being a disaster, but we'll see. So I've titled this, How to Include Graphs, Figures, or Tables in Your Economic Analysis Paper. And I mean this would be kind of broad relative to any type of paper that you might write for an economics class, but in particular, ones that I would be looking at, right? So you can get some APA suggestions from the Purdue Online Writing Laboratory. This is a link that'll help you see how to cite figures and graphs, because there's a different citation convention for a figure or graph than it would be for some other content you'd be bringing into your paper. I believe they've given a little bit of bad advice. I mean, I know this is the official APA like advice, and this is what's in some cases the advice might end up being, but I disagree with this. It says relation of tables or figures in text, and this is if you click through that link right there, because tables and figures supplement the text, refer to the text in all tables and figures used, and explain what the reader should look for using the table or figure. Focus only on the important point the reader should draw from them. Leave the details to the reader to examine on their own, which I partially agree with, right? You don't want to develop a whole bunch of mundane details, but I think this is following from the writing advice from D.J. McCluskey, which is, if you can include a table, a figure, a graph in your paper, you've got to say something about it. You want to explain what the thing is doing, and you want to provide some guidance in terms of what the reader is going to expect, right? So is going to expect to take away. So my comment here, if you're going to use graphs, figures, tables in your paper submission, you want to be really careful. Firstly, you got to develop the ability to discern whether or not that thing should be in your paper in the first place, and whether or not it's just a space filler, right? So you've seen the case where somebody, maybe you try this yourself, hopefully not, where you try to fill a 3-page paper with 3 pictures, and before you know it, you only have to type 3 words, and there's your paper, right? And that doesn't work so well, and professor's going to see through that, of course. But then, that's the extreme case. In a less extreme case, you want to think carefully. What's the point of having this figure, this graph, or whatever, this table? Is it tangentially related to what you're doing, or is it central, right? If it's central, then you want to put it in a prominent place in the body of the paper, and then develop your argument around it. If it's not central, develop the idea of whether or not it belongs in the paper in the first place. If not, then you're going to want to probably cut it. If it does belong in the paper, if you needed to develop your argument, but it's not central, what I would do is I would place it in an appendix, and then I'd talk about it in the text. So second advice, well, you got to determine if the figure, graph, or whatever belongs in the body of the paper or the appendix. If the resource is essential to the line of reasoning you're building, it might make sense to keep it in the body, as I said. If it's not, if it's more or less anecdotal, if it's just kind of supporting, I'd place it in the appendix. If you're including a graph, figure, or table in the paper, you've got to provide at least a paragraph description and explanation. It's really important to make sure that you and the reader are on the same page, right? You want the reader to have the same takeaway as you, or at least to be able to know what your intended interpretation is, right? That's the primary thing I disagree with, like the APA advice, manual advice on here, which is focus only on the important point the reader should draw from them, leave the details to the reader to examine on their own. Okay, yeah, maybe some of the more mundane details leave to the reader, but you definitely want to explain what the contribution of the graph figure table is, and what's your interpretation and how you're using it in the paper. The way that I like to explain to students is if there's going to be a graph or whatever in your paper, you should describe it thoroughly enough in the body of the paper that I actually don't need to look at the appendix to see it, or I actually don't need to look at the graph to see the paper. You've given a sufficient description, and then by the time I do look at it, I'm like, oh yeah, that's exactly what they were telling me I was going to see. And I confirm that you've got the correct interpretation or whatever of the thing that you're including. Let me give an example. So during the pandemic, the Federal Reserve took swift action to lower interest rates, increase the money supply. Right? Fed has to be able to determine where the money is, to be able to know how it's going to indirectly influence the economy by affecting the money supply. And so the way that it does this is via the money aggregates, right? So the Fed categorizes money using money aggregates. So this is like M1, M2, and so on and so forth. Historically, M1 had been checkable deposits, traveler's checks, cash in the hands of the non-bank public, right? That's what was M1, the most liquid forms of money. M2 had been all of M1 plus additional savings deposits, right? Things that are a little bit less liquid, right? We're going into then M2. And so on and so forth. So M1 is contained in M2, which includes, everything we think of as usual money plus savings deposits, right? And here's a picture now. The following data series represents the St. Louis, or it comes from the St. Louis Fed's Fred site, showing the growth in M1 kind of recently during, beginning of 2020. And you see the sharp increase, right? Here's like the citation or whatever. And I said, you might have noticed the title of the graph includes the fact that the data series has been discontinued. In 2020, the Fed redefined M1 and produced a new graph. At the very top here, it says like discontinued. If you go to the site, it directs you to a different version of M1, M1SL, right? And that's what I'll show next. Okay, so here it is right here. If you've not done a good job of introducing either the paragraph or the graph in the paper, if you've not done a good job of introducing either graph in this paper, whatever. So I'm trying to read what I wrote rather than just explain. That's probably the bad way to do it. I didn't tell you what you're looking for here and why. You're left to develop your interpretation as to what is going on. This might be incorrect and might certainly not be what I had in mind. If I just show you, hey, look, here's this graph, right? Have a look at M1. Right? And then we see discontinued. Okay. We've got to form some reasons. Probably you're going to reflect on why. Well, firstly, M1 jumped a whole bunch. Secondly, why it was the case that the Fed redefined M1. Okay. You probably see this big jump in the money supply. You attribute that maybe to the Fed's response to the pandemic, which is partially true, no doubt. But that's not completely incorrect. Notice the graph alone actually overstates the magnitude of the Fed's intervention, right? Actually, this caused great confusion, seeing that the Fed had discontinued the original M1, redefined, and so on and so forth. There's some pundits and analysts that accuse the Fed of redefining M1 in order to hide the massive surge in the money supply, right? I've heard this on podcasts, I've heard this in the media. Maybe you've heard that too, or maybe this is entirely new. My comment is, it's actually a silly argument because both the historic M1 and the new M1SL series both demonstrate like a $12 trillion jump from 2020 March to June 2020, right? It's also incorrect. The reason why the Fed redefined M1 and discontinued the older series is because it was increasingly inaccurate. Remember, years and years ago, there's a much sharper distinction between savings deposits and checkable deposits, right? Even before there were ATMs, it was like really difficult. Before there was ATMs, it was really difficult to be able to transfer money. You'd actually like physically have to go to the bank. I remember doing that about 25 years ago, right? Then there's ATMs that had that capability. Before long, there is online bill pay, there is online banking, and now actually you can pay bills directly from a savings account, right? Which actually places, with few restrictions, far smaller barrier between your use and access to a savings account as a deposit account, right? So the idea is we want M1 to be the most liquid form of money, the most accessible. Can people access this and get it into the economy really quick? If so, that's kind of the philosophy for what we're going to include in M1. That's imprecise, certainly. And then if it's a little bit less liquid, but people can still access it, that's going into M2. Okay, that historically includes savings deposits. But now, realizing there's a smaller barrier between checkable deposits and savings accounts, Fed redefined M1 to include savings deposits, right? And in doing so, that tripled the value of, or tripled the amount of like M1 overnight when they made that change. So then they switched over to reporting this as M1SL. So that's my comment right here. More recently, with the rise of online banking, it's pretty easy to transfer money between accounts. There's federal regulations that affect how many transfers, something like 6 out of savings accounts, right? Beyond this, your savings account functions pretty much like a checking account. I've got bill pay set up coming from my savings account, right? It can do that. And so this change occurred in May 2020, caused M1 to triple overnight. If you simply view the graph, you'll probably miss that, and you'll miss the explanation for the drastic jump. Graph also overstates the magnitude of the Fed's response to the pandemic because of that. However, remember, there's a way to kind of verify, tell that what I'm telling you is correct, right? Remember, M2 always included M1 plus savings deposits. The definition of M2 really didn't change, right? So if we compare the old M2 to the new M2SL, we see a more accurate representation of the increase in the money supply specific to the Fed's response to the pandemic after separating out the portion of the jump in M1 due to the new definition. So let me show you this. Here was the original M2. It's got the same discontinued qualifier at the top. You see this much smaller jump, right? Because this is now M2. The definition of M2 didn't change. This would be like the portion of the increase in money supply that we attribute more accurately to the Fed's response to pandemic with accommodating monetary policy. The older M2 was replaced by M2SL in 2020 to capture the inclusion of savings deposits into M1SL, but the impact on M2 and M2SL was minimal. In the following time series, we see the level of M2 rising from about 15.5 trillion to 18.2 trillion in 2020. I just did that by like hovering over these graphs, which are real nice. It's great that the St. Louis Fred, the data site, has this, makes kind of a lot of the data series way more accessible, right? And continues slowly growing, then begins lowering in 2022, which is when the Fed began its policy of raising interest rates to combat inflation. Anyway, so I hope you found this video interesting. I hope you haven't been trying to chat with me on the chat because I don't have access to this right here, which is a very big reason as to why I may not continue using ManyCam for my upcoming economics live stream, but we will see. I don't know. And also, if you hadn't yet been familiar with the St. Louis Fred site, have a look. You can find local data, you can find some interesting data, stuff from the BLS, stuff from BEA, Bureau of Labor Statistics, Bureau of Economic Analysis. Labor Statistics, Bureau of Labor Statistics tracks, obviously like unemployment data and so on and so forth. I've got another video that's useful for that. BEA, Bureau of Economic Analysis, is the one that's in charge of measuring GDP. It also pulls in data sites from U.S. Census for imports and exports, useful for trade statistics, a whole variety of other things. So basically, if there's some interesting economic data that you're interested in exploring, well, just go to your favorite search engine and then type in at the end of it, right, St. Louis Fred, and it'll probably bring you to a nice, easily digestible graph. I mean, I could have been a little bit more clever and pulled and changed the years here. I think I can't quite see this. It's really small on my screen. Might go down to like 1947, which might be the default. If you zoom in here, of course, that makes the magnitude look a little bit different. Although that's just stretching the axes. You have to actually pay attention to the numbers themselves. Anyway, this has gone along a little bit longer than I had intended, given that I wanted to be a little bit more interactive and realizing it is not at all interactive here. I'm going to go ahead. I'm going to stop the stream now, take a look at what I've created. Hopefully it's not horrible. Hope you enjoyed. And then stay tuned in the future once I figure this out and I'm able to have some type of interactive mini lecture, response, question, whatever, review session thing in the future for principles micro and then intermediate micro. Anyway, bye for now, I hope. I'm going to try to turn off the screen. I don't know, maybe you'll see me like awkwardly fumbling around trying to get this to go away. We will see. Bye for now.